Hi everyone, welcome back to RPMbassy. This is Mark, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about this album right here. It's Substrata by Biosphere. So this is an album that I've been a big fan of for a long time. If you saw the top 20, you'll remember I had another Biosphere album in that one. But in many ways, actually, I think on recollection, this is actually the better album of the two, so I probably should have included this one. It's a 1997 album. Many would consider it one of the kind of best or characteristic albums of the Arctic ambient kind of subgenre of ambient music. It is a fantastic album, as I mentioned, and I just kind of wanted to go through a little bit about what each song kind of means to me, how it feels, the moods along the sort of listening process of the album, and go into a little bit more about Biosphere as an artist. So to sort of start off with, Biosphere is a musician from Norway called Geir Jensen, based out of Tromsø in the sort of far north end of Norway into the Arctic Circle. And he's been making music for the better part of sort of 40, if not more, years now. He was making music in the early 80s under the name E-Man, and he was also part of a group called Bel Canto, which is kind of like a sort of synth pop group, really. Actually, I should probably tell John about them, although most likely he already knows of them or knows them personally, knowing him. So yeah, he had those two projects. He eventually left Bel Canto, but you can actually see, if you listen to some of their work from the two albums that he performed on, you can actually see quite a lot of things and elements that he would end up using in his Biosphere work as well. In 1990, he released an album called The North Pole by Submarine, and that was under the artist name of Bleep. Bleep is quite an appropriate name for that, really. He was using a lot of like 303s, and it kind of had a bit of that weird acid house kind of element to it, or ambient house almost. It is a good album. I wouldn't say it's as good as the stuff that he released afterwards under the Biosphere name, but it's definitely worth a listen, as is his E-Man and the Bel Canto work as well that he appeared on. So in 1991 he made his first release under the name of Biosphere, which was the album Microgravity, which is a very good bridge in between what he kind of became known to make and the stuff that he'd done previously. So there's definitely a kind of electronica vibe to it, but there's a lot of ambient elements as well, very kind of drony, washy synths throughout, and that's really worth a listen as well, to see the progression of his career. A few years after that, he released his second album, Patashnik, which again, same sort of thing, it just kind of let a little bit more into the ambient elements. There was actually a single off of that one which was used in a Levi's advert, which he sort of went on to regret allowing. I feel like he's always kind of been one of these artists who just wants to release it for listeners rather than for any commercial purposes. And then 1997 was when he released Substrata. So to go into a little bit more about this, as I say, it is truly like Arctic ambient. The album cover kind of says it all, really. You can sort of just about see a very sort of wide, stretched out panorama of mountains there, and obviously the single mountain there, and that's kind of repeated on the liner as well. That is pretty much it for the actual physical copy. It's just two records and the work, the artwork itself. That's it. There's no sort of fancy pull-outs or anything like that. So track by track, and just how the album sort of starts off. First song is one called As the Sun Kissed the Horizon. I say song, it's not a song, it's basically just something that he's recorded as a field recording, and that's kind of a technique that he uses throughout a lot of the album and through a lot of his work in general. I mean, sampling as a whole is something that he's sort of lent heavily on throughout the years. You can sometimes as well pick up over different releases where you can hear little snippets of certain bits and pieces, and that's always a kind of like a little treat that you kind of recognise elements from songs. I don't know whether or not thematically the intent is that the songs are connected or not, but it's nice all the same. So yeah, as I say, Sun Kissed the Horizon, it's just a recording of sort of like, I presume, from Tlemcen, just like children playing, there's some sort of like street noise, and a plane going overhead, kind of, you know, the sound of the plane fading out gradually. And I think that sets the tone for the album, and the way that it feels very, very well. That kind of like sound of civilization fading out, and then being replaced with the second track, Poet Alpina, which is a very haunting track. Lots of kind of, I don't know whether or not it's like some sort of percussion, like tune percussion, like, where it's not like a marimba, I don't think, but it's got that kind of tonality to it. It's essentially a washy kind of watercolor synth underneath the bottom of it, or perhaps like sampled strings or woodwinds or something kind of flowing as a backdrop, and then this kind of percussive tune percussion just playing a few notes really. It's not an incredibly in-depth song, but it's a very good mood setter. And I would say, if you want an idea of Biosphere as an artist and an idea of the album as a whole, Poet Alpina is probably one of the ones to listen to decide, well, will I like this? Because if you like Poet Alpina, you're going to enjoy this album as a whole. So it really is a good way to start the album off. And I think the progression of the songs, as we'll kind of discuss going through, it really does feel like a journey. The way that civilization, kind of sounds of civilization fading out to be replaced with this kind of haunting, cold sounding synthesizer soundscape, it kind of does feel as if you're travelling in some sort of Arctic landscape and kind of getting further and further away from safety, from humanity. A little bit maddening, but also wanderlusty in a way. There's something about it kind of sets the album off in a really, really good way. Chakung, the third track, that's pretty much just a single bass note repeated and kind of working as the, again, almost the backdrop for the song. There are some like synth bits playing throughout it, but the bass just like boom, boom, all the way through. And it's a small part of the song, but bearing in mind it's like a good sort of 7.5 minutes long, there is a portion quite near the end where that single bass note goes up by maybe a step in terms of the tuning, and it really frames the song perfectly. Do listen to that track as well. I'm going to say this for every single song on the album, I'm afraid, but do listen to that track. That one change, which I think plays maybe twice, that note maybe plays twice, really sets the mood for that song. Feels a little bit more sparse versus Poet Alpina, just because it's not quite as full and wide sounding. It's a little bit more close quarters. The things I will tell you, so that's track 4 on the album. That's the first one with a kind of definitive sample. Obviously, as I say, there's sampling all over this album and all over the rest of his work, but this has a specific sample that a lot of people will recognise. So it's from Twin Peaks, I think the first episode of season 2, and it's the tall man, the giant. Essentially, when at the start of that episode, when he wakes Agent Cooper up, and he has some things to tell him, and that's used in this track to pretty tremendous effect. It even has the, if you remember the episode, there's kind of like radio static almost that you kind of have before he appears, and that's like a sound effect that's used in the TV show quite a bit. Again, it's one of those things, it kind of feels, the album feels like a journey through some sort of Arctic wasteland, and that feels like a radio transmission from home base or something like that. The mood of Twin Peaks fits the mood of this album as well, very well. So if you're a fan of Twin Peaks and how that makes you feel, this will sit very well with you. I think that kind of slightly off-kilter, ambiguous kind of vibe that you can't really quite nail down, but you know that it's unnerving, but almost a bit nostalgic as well. Track 5. This is one that I know a lot of listeners have a bit of a problem with. It's the song Times When I Know You'll Be Sad. I personally don't dislike this song. I will say it's probably not the strongest on the album, that's a given. It's essentially just a guitar line going like boom, 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 all the way through. And that in and of itself, I think is great. Really nice, hypnotic ambient. But the sample is sort of where a lot of people draw umbrage from this song, I think. And it is just a repeated line of times when I know you'll be sad. It does get a little bit grating. It's not bad, but it definitely weakens the track. And I think as a sample goes, it doesn't sort of fit 100% within the melody, if you will, of the song. It kind of feels a little bit dissonant. I would say that's probably the weakest song on the album because of that. But it's still a nice mood, it has a nice tone to it. So, you know, for the sake of a song, you don't skip it, okay? Hyperborea, the track after that, brings it right back. We go back to Twin Peaks with another sample from there. But the instrumentation is what really draws me into it. I presume it's a sample. It's kind of got a sort of scraping sort of noise. And to me, in my head, the first thing I think is kind of ice flows on water, kind of sort of blocks of ice kind of scraping against each other, or things rushing down rivers and stuff. It's got that kind of a sound to it. Kind of brings the coldness in a little bit more. The sample on the track is a speech from the same episode of Twin Peaks, season 2, episode 1. But it's Major Garland Briggs when he's talking to his son in the diner. He's talking about his vision. He's sort of standing on the veranda of a vast estate, as he says.
In my vision, I was on the veranda of a vast estate, palazzo of some fantastic proportion.
In terms of the thematic bearing of the song, it doesn't really sort of seem like there's a ton of meaning behind it, but in terms of how that speech feels in the scene, that kind of reminiscence and, you know, the hidden meaning behind dreams and things like that, the song itself does a very good job of conveying that. Track after that, Cobracia, or Cobracia. Cobracia, that also uses a sample. It's from, I think it's Karl Nikolev. He's a Russian telepath, or was, I don't know if he's still around. But it's him in Russian kind of describing an object in another room telepathically. This, as I said before, like it feels like this kind of chapters throughout. This track kind of feels like almost the end of the safe part of the album in a way. Instrumentation, the song itself is very similar to what Biosphere would do a lot more of later, where it's very orchestral sounding. There's a lot of string samples and things like that, or it sounds like it. It could be synthesizers and stuff instead, but it has, again, just a few different kind of notes and chords that go throughout it, but it's very, very washy and very soundscapey. The end of the track finishes off with, it almost sounds like a radio losing signal. It's got some, like, you know, radio tuning sounds and stuff, and it really does kind of feel like final step away from civilization, and there's no humanity past this stage. So then it goes into the song Antennaria. This is where this album kind of gets quite scary. This is, I feel like we've sort of almost had kind of the late afternoon for the album, and now this is where it starts to turn to night. A lot more moody. It's almost like if you've ever heard shepherd's tones, that kind of falling kind of sound that repeats upon itself through octaves. It has that kind of sound to it, where almost jarring, I think, to us as humans. It kind of sounds wrong, but it's very cool as well. There's a few kind of sample parts in this which I think must be... It sounds like bottles or something like that that are in water kind of crashing against each other. That to me kind of brings to mind the idea of kind of discovering some sort of abandoned ghost town or something, some sort of coastal town that has been long forgotten. As I said, with the sort of journey kind of feel of the album, that really fits as the sort of thing like, oh, it's hit nightfall and you've discovered this place to rest. Uva Ursi, the next track, quite a short song for one. This has some humming in it. Potentially it could be, I don't know whether or not it is, but it could be sampled from the same song that the Times When I Know You'll Be Sad sample is taken from. It has that same kind of sort of, not barbershop quartet, but group male vocal kind of sound to it, but it is just a choral kind of hum that goes throughout the song. And there's some little samples of like, I think it's horse footsteps or hoof steps. I suppose you could take that two ways. Is it, if we take the previous song as you discovering perhaps somewhere to stay for the night, are the hoof steps the sound of you travelling into this area, or is it someone else travelling that doesn't know you're there? So again, really good mood from that one. The track after that, Sphere of No Form, the penultimate track on the main part of the album. One of the scariest songs I've ever listened to. It's not aggressive or anything like that. It doesn't invoke any particular fear, but I think that's probably why it's one of the scariest songs. The name itself, Sphere of No Form, kind of conjures up sort of eldritch horrors and bizarre creatures that you can't comprehend mentally. The song itself, it starts off with what sounds like a bell, and it almost feels kind of demonic or some sort of summoning ritualistic kind of thing. And then there's this weird just drone like kind of thing that goes through it, and that changes in pitch throughout the song. I can't kind of describe a lot of how it sounds. It is really, really kind of thought-provoking and kind of sets you in a very weird place. So it's really a fantastic track to kind of, what I would say is end the story almost. There is the track after it, Silene. If I was to sort of put a narrative to it fully, Sphere of No Form kind of feels like the end of the human side of the journey, and Silene kind of feels like some sort of an afterlife or something like that. Is a lot more calm, and it kind of harkens back to some of the noises and the sounds that we had in the first half of the album. Less spooky for sure, but still quite odd and off-kilter. But it's a fantastic way to end the album proper. There is one more track on the album on side D, which is Leica. So it's the only track on that side of the album. It's a bonus track really, so don't treat it as the same as the rest of the songs. I personally wouldn't consider it part of whatever narrative I've made up in my head about this album. But it is a good track, and it does in a way serve as kind of almost a bit of a rewind of the whole album. There's elements that you can pick up that kind of seem to hark back to different steps throughout the entire album. So, you know, if you're going to be sat listening to it anyway, you might as well get one more track in, right? Now, in terms of next steps, if you enjoy this album, if you do give it a listen, if you haven't already, the next steps sort of after this obviously are more Biosphere. That's a given. This album does actually have kind of a what's called a part 2. It's labelled as Substrata 2 or Substrata Squared, and that is, it's actually the soundtrack to a film called Man with a Movie Camera, a very, very old film, not too similar to the rest of the album, and it's only available CD and digitally, so, you know, for the purposes of RPMbassy vinyl reviews kind of side of things, that's kind of a non-factor in a way. But I do recommend listening to it. It's still a fantastic piece of work. But as far as the name goes, Substrata Squared or Substrata 2, I would still treat it a little bit differently, kind of distance it a bit from the album itself, just because it doesn't quite have the same feel. It's still very good, but a little bit more similar to the work he would have done on Microgravity and Patashnik, rather than this one. Other than that, next steps. What I would suggest is the one that I used in our top 20 rundown list, HIA and Biosphere polar sequences. This was actually the year prior to Substrata, but there are pieces in this which, as I mentioned about Sphere of No Form being a scary song, there are pieces in this which hit that kind of feel as well, and the album cover actually is very, very ideal for it. It's a bit ambiguous and a little bit wrong looking as to what it all is, what it all means. So yeah, in terms of feel, if you liked the scary stuff or the off sounding stuff from Substrata, do check this one out as well. It is very, very worth a listen. Outside of that, I would also say another one worth a listen is John Carpenter's The Thing soundtrack. So I will do some more, I will do another video on this at some point, because it's too good of a record or too good of an album to not talk about in depth. It's a fantastic, fantastic soundtrack, and unfortunately one that didn't really get used in the film itself. So most of the music on this is by Ennio Morricone. The main sort of theme that everybody knows, the boom boom, I believe is by John Carpenter himself, as he did like to do that in his films. But you know, if you know this film, you know that the polar kind of cold themes make a lot of sense for this. This is again, you know, mainly a horror soundtrack, but there are some sort of weird ambient bits and pieces in it. So that's definitely a journey that, if you really enjoyed that particular side of Substrata, give these two a listen. Beyond that, the rest of his work is a great way to kind of continue on. As I say, do listen to Microgravity and Patashnik. They're slightly different because they've got some more drums and things like that going on, and it's definitely a little bit more of an electronica album, but they're still very, very good, and you can see where he came from to then go on to make this. Just prior to this as well, actually, it's worth mentioning, he did a soundtrack to a Norwegian film called Insomnia, and there are a couple of samples that, off the top of my head, I can't remember whether or not the samples are used here or potentially in other work that he's done. I think in the polar sequences, I think there are definitely some samples between that and the Insomnia soundtrack. That, again, really kind of spooky, off-kilter kind of sound. That's worth checking out, and the film itself is worth checking out as well. After that, he did an album called Cirque, which is a little bit more of a return to what he did on Microgravity. Really fantastic album, and that kind of has a very hypnotic kind of feel to it. I would say it's not something that I listen to in the same way as Substrata. Substrata, I can put that on and just listen and think, and it kind of washes over you, and it's like a whole experience unto itself. Cirque has more of a hyper-focused kind of feel to it. Very ideal if you're doing some sort of technical work or writing or something like that. That's a fantastic album to listen to. I do recommend it for that purpose, if nothing else. Following on from that, did an album called Shenzhou, which is very, very similar to what he did on the song Cabracia in terms of that orchestral sampling kind of sound, but this is very much orchestral sampling. If you're familiar with William Basinski, you'll probably like Shenzhou a lot. It's lots of kind of loops of very short passages of music which kind of build and build into this kind of all-encompassing soundscape. Quite haunting again, but if you like that kind of sound, that sampled orchestral sound, you'll probably like Shenzhou a lot. After that, he's done many things. You know, explore it at your own leisure, really. Those would be the sort of, that kind of portion of his career, I'd say, is what's really worth listening to and comparing back to this. But that said, he did last year in 2022 release Substrata alternative versions, or alternate versions. That is an album that I think, because I'm so used to Substrata, the alternate versions can sometimes feel a little bit jarring. There are some tracks on it which the changes don't feel right. Then they're by no means worse. It's fantastic. And actually the track Jakung has some sort of like synthy percussiveness to it, which kind of adds a whole new element to the album, actually. So it's, again, worth listening to. Also worth noting that the samples, the Twin Peaks samples, don't appear in their original tracks. The Garland Briggs speech does appear, but it's actually in Silene at the end of the album, which is a bit weird. But as I say, it's an alternate versions. They're kind of variations in production, so it kind of shows how his creative process was when he was making this album, and how it ended up creating two different types of work that have two different moods. As a very final aside, which, this is again not really related to vinyl records, but if you are into reading and you haven't already read this, I do very much recommend pairing this album up with the book Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. So that album really does feel like a journey, and this book is, essentially a journey. It's not an overly long book. It doesn't take too long to read. You could probably get it done in a single sitting if you wished. This is how I read it. I read it with this in the background when I first read it a few years ago. This has some of the most weird and bizarre imagery in anything that I've ever read. And the weird, bizarre parts of the album, and especially that last half of the album where it feels slightly dangerous and unsafe, go with this so perfectly. Kind of makes me wish that the film of Annihilation was a little bit more pared back and kind of just had something like this just running throughout the entire film, because I hate the film, to be quite honest. If you haven't read the book and you love the film, please do check the book out, because I feel like a lot of people will become converts and realise that the book is, at least in my opinion, so much better. But yeah, do give it a go if you can. Seek out this album, seek out this book, pair the two together, because it makes for a fantastic experience. And after all, that kind of is what we're after when it comes to listening to music, and especially records, that experience of kind of sitting back and kind of allowing yourself to focus on the feel and the sound. Vinyl just has something to it, and this album in particular is one of those ones that really hits the nail on the head as far as that sound, that feel, that vibe, where you can just experience music in its kind of purest sense, just listening to music. But yeah, anyway, that's going to do it for this one. Please do let me know if you've got any thoughts on this album, or Biosphere's other work, or any of the other bits and pieces I mentioned in this video. And if you've got any questions or suggestions for other videos, again, do let us know, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much. Goodbye.